Hello and welcome back to the Cloister. In today's episode, the second in our Lent series provided by our good friends at Glenstill Abbey, Father Brendan reflects on the Transfiguration. To find out more about Glenstill Abbey and retreats they have coming up, you can visit them online at glenstill.com. I pray that these reflections will be a blessing to you this Lent.
As Father Luke said, I'm not going to speak directly about the Transfiguration as we find it in the Gospel account, but I'm going to speak about Transfiguration itself. 2 years ago, here during Lent, on this actual Sunday, I gave a talk also about the Transfiguration. And so rather than saying more or less the same thing again to you 2 years later, I've decided to put a slightly different slant on things this time and to look at transfiguration or transformation in our own lives and what that actually means for me, rather than looking at the gospel scene of Jesus on the mountain. Lewis Carroll has some wonderful puzzles in his famous book, Alice in Wonderland. And this is one of my favourites. Alice's journey across the chessboard was starting to befuddle her mind. Then, to her delight, she spied a signpost with 4 arrows. "Now I shall be back on my way to becoming a queen," she said happily. But just as the words left her mouth, a gust of wind uprooted the signpost. Alice picked up the signpost and was surprised to find that it was still intact. "I have no map and no one to ask for directions," she said to herself. "However am I to find my way now?" The answer, of course, is actually very simple. If Alice replaces the sign with the name of the place she has just visited, pointing in the right direction, all the other arrows will be pointing in the right direction too. The lesson for us being, if I don't know from where I have come, I have no hope at all of finding my way to the place where I am going. Another Lewis from Oxford, this time C.S. Lewis, makes very plain that the place from which we have all come is called pride, and the place that we're seeking on the signpost of life is called humility. And I don't think that I need to tell you that Saint Benedict would agree with him. We have all tried travelling down this road. As Lewis puts it, if you think you're not conceited, it means you must be very conceited indeed. This Lent, I'd like to suggest to you that we all concentrate on the seismic struggle within each one of us between my pride and humility in my own life. Most people today are under the mistaken impression that Christianity has been obsessed with sex for the last 2,000 years. That shows a complete lack of both historical and theological knowledge. Because according to all the great Christian teachers down the ages, the essential vice and the utmost evil is in fact pride. It was pride that made the devil become the devil. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. It is pride, too, which ultimately causes wars and conflicts. And we can all see only too clearly where that gets us. And it is far from a pretty picture. Pride has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and in every family since the world began. And John Cassian, the famous monk of the desert in those very early centuries, in his 5th conference, lists his famous 8 vices as follows: gluttony, fornication, greed and love of money, anger, sadness, acedia, boastfulness, and top of the class, pride. He elaborates on this further in the 12th book of his Institutes, and he says, "Our 8th and last combat is against the spirit of pride, which evil, although it is the latest in our conflict with our faults and stands last on the list, yet in beginning and in order of time is the first, an evil beast that is most savage and more dreadful than all the former ones, chiefly trying those who are perfect and devouring with its dreadful bite those who have almost attained the consummation of virtue." John Cassian was concerned about this evil above all others because he believed that it attacked the whole person and not just one part of the person. Every other fault you can think of operates within bounds and limits, but not pride. Pride has no bounds or limits. Pride led to Satan's fall and to the sin of Adam and Eve. And if we wish to escape from its clutches, Cassian believes, we have to learn how to cooperate in our own lives with what he calls divine compassion. And he uses 2 examples. The example of the good thief on the cross, and the example of King David repenting his great sin. Here are 2 people who knew what it was to embrace humility and to cooperate with divine compassion in their own lives. Now, Cassian, being a monk, also paints a picture for us of the monk who has sunk into pride. And he describes him as follows: This carnal pride, when it has gained an entrance into the heart of a monk and has made a bad start in renouncing the world, does not allow him to stoop from his former state of worldly haughtiness to the true humility of Christ. But first of all, it makes him disobedient and rough. Then it does not let him be gentle and kindly, nor allows him to be on a level with and like his brothers. Nor does it permit him to be stripped and deprived of his worldly goods. It makes him, on the contrary, hope for a long life and covers him with shame and confusion. If when stripped of everything he has begun to be supported by the property of others and not his own, it persuades him that it is much better for food and clothing to be provided for him by his own, rather than another's means. So for John Cashin, the proud monk is disobedient and rough. He is not gentle and kindly. He wants to be constantly different from all the other monks. He wants to hoard things for his own and live from independent means, not being content to depend on the monastery to support him. Now you can make your own slight adjustments depending on your state in life, and you have your own picture of pride to work from. But Cashin goes further and gives us the remedy for pride. First, the foundations of true humility are laid in our heart, which can then bear the weight of perfection and love upon them. Next, the yoke of obedience must be taken up. And these, according to him, are the tools that we use to combat pride within us: humility and obedience. And to this, we can add the words of St. Benedict in his rule. He says, "We therefore urge that in these days of Lent, the monks should lead lives of great purity, and should also in this sacred season expiate the negligences of other times." Now, I can't go any further in this conference on pride without turning to Benedict's rule, chapter 7, which is called On Humility. Because part of our Lenten journey every year should involve each one of us looking at my relationship with other people, with the community in which I live, my family. And the best place to begin this examination is St. Benedict's first degree of humility, that the monk always keep what he calls the fear of God before his eyes. In communities and families, we have very personal relationships with one another. However, each of us need to look at our relationship with our community as a whole as well, with our family as a whole, and not just as a group of individuals. In the Acts of the Apostles, we find an example of this, when the couple, Ananias and Sapphira, sell their property and give only part of the proceeds to the community when they had promised to give it all. This action wasn't a personal offence against anyone, but it was an offence against the whole community. And such offences do exist. And quite often today, we tend to forget that. We can easily fall into the trap today of thinking that only personal offences are really offences. Lent is a time when all of us need to look at our behaviours, to look at how our personal habits have effects beyond what we may ever have intended. We have to look at what our habits tell others about our own values and about what we value in our own life. And at the same time, we need to remember that we can never judge our sister or brother, because that is not my role. My engagement with the community in which I live, with my family, makes a statement about my real opinion of that community or that family. How do I treat my community or family? It should involve both give and take, and not just take. The challenge is for me to look at my life and to ask what I do to the community, the people with whom I live, when I act in certain ways. We're called in Lent to be much more sensitive to this dimension of living with other people. St. Benedict's steps of humility go against so much of what is held up as being important today. And step 2 certainly does so. Naturally, I love my own will, and I take pleasure in satisfying my own desires, whatever they may be. And thus, this road of humility that St. Benedict maps out for us is clearly, from the very beginning, a road that is not going to be easy, one that is quite hard to follow. I'm invited to become single-minded in seeking God's will and in doing God's will. For Benedict, the abbot is someone who's placed over a community, the person in authority, if you like. And this is his third step. The abbot is not someone better than the rest of us, and not someone who knows more than the rest of us do. He's certainly not someone holier than everyone else. The abbot, the person in authority, whoever that might be in my life, is just another human being, but one who is set over a community, and in a monastery, one who stands in the place of Christ in the community. And it's for this reason and this reason alone that Benedict calls him Father. Today, there's a lot of emphasis and talk on leadership, on consensus, and all the other nice qualities that work so well in a perfect community. And there is nothing at all wrong with any of these things. But St. Benedict, in his rule, seems not to expect to find this kind of community in his monastery. He knows that perfect communities do not exist, either inside or outside of monasteries. And so for Benedict, consensus in the end lies in following the decision that the abbot eventually arrives at, which he's supposed to reach after carefully listening to what each of the monks has to say. And this remains the case for Benedict, even if the abbot happens to be stubborn, contradictory, or, God forbid, a bit stupid. There is no doubt that Benedict wants the abbot of the community to listen to each of the members. Benedict always wants the abbot to strive to make good decisions. He wants the community to listen to the abbot too, and he wants them to listen to each other. The real challenge in Lent for me around all of this is, how do I deal with this in my own life, in my own circumstances? It's the question of the human frailty of those with whom I live. Problems are actually inevitable in every group of people, in every community, in every family, because not everyone is going to agree on everything all of the time. This is Benedict's fourth step, and it is a very difficult one. And if step 4 is difficult, step 5 really puts it up to me. This is one of those things in the spiritual tradition that really demands a deep humility. And most of us, if we're honest, are simply too frightened to try it. The 5th step of humility for Benedict is that the monk does not conceal from his abbot any sinful thoughts entering his heart, or any wrongs committed in secret, but rather confesses them humbly. This step is really about honesty. It's about integrity. It is really very important, because living a double life in any circumstance in life is terribly, terribly destructive. Lent is a time for each one of us to examine my honesty. The meanest and the worst of everything. There are some people who just love this next step. And if you like it too much, you probably need to go and see a doctor. If we have worked hard to do steps 2, 3, 4, and 5, then the 6th step will hardly delay us at all. We find this manner of living even among non-Christians who are seeking a spiritual path. What I do is not always the definitive thing. How I do it can make all the difference in the world. We're in no way being invited to think, oh, I'm so undervalued by my community, by my family, but I shall offer it all up to God for his greater glory. That's nonsense. It is a matter of deeply believing that the evaluation that other people make of me is not really important, and that I can do whatever I'm asked to do with great joy and gladness if I so choose. This isn't about low self-esteem, but rather a simple recognition of who I am before the Lord. My value comes from the Lord. My life comes from the Lord. Living the next step, step 7, is impossible if we're focused on anything or anyone other than God. If we look at God, then we see only God in everything, and yet still know our own weakness and failures. The weakness and failures of others no longer really concerns us. It doesn't distract us, for we're never able to judge them anyway. Our own weakness, our own failures, this is what we do know. And the purpose of humility is to learn God's ways, God's commandments, put into practice in my own life. Step 8 goes against my desire to be different from others and show the world that I am better than they are. So often, I want to do that which is different simply to assert my own identity. What this step of humility is telling me is that I must find my identity from within and not from what I do or the important job that I've been given. Step 9 trains us in patience. Patience is that wonderful virtue that helps us suffer for the sake of growth. Can you imagine actually not speaking unless someone asks you a question for a whole day? How many words do we use each day that are completely unnecessary? How often do we use talk and chatter to distract ourselves from what's actually important? Only a fool raises his voice in laughter, says Benedict. This step is a bit like the previous one, but now we struggle against ourselves. There is a laughter that delights in the Lord and in others, and this is very good and necessary. But there is another kind of laughter that comes from far less positive realities within me. How often do I just laugh out of nervousness? Do I laugh at times simply because other people are laughing? Sometimes my laughter hurts others or makes light of something which actually should be taken quite seriously. Do I use laughter as a weapon? Because it can be a weapon. We all know that it can. Step 11. The wise person is known by their few words. Silence can teach us to speak gently. And gentleness always helps others to hear what we want to say to them. We know that if we go to a person and start a conversation with insulting words, that person will not hear us. Today, there's always the temptation to send an email instead of talking directly to someone, and that's just as bad. Benedict would have us exercise discretion in all things. How many of us know people who take half an hour to say what could be said in 2 minutes? Can we strive to be modest, brief, and reasonable in our speech? Does that really ask too much? Lent is a time to reflect on how I measure up in this way. The last step, the one who manifests humility in their very being. And of course, this is where we're all trying to arrive. This is where Alice's sign is pointing, if she puts it in the ground correctly. There are people with very poor self-image, who always have their heads bowed down and their eyes downcast. But this is not true humility. This is not the type of attitude that Benedict describes here. The person who is humble has a true sense of self-worth. This person knows that God is always present. The truly humble person knows when to look up and when to look down, when to bow the head, when to lift the head. And there are 3 things that characterize someone at this level of integration. Acting from the love of Christ, from good habits, and from delight in virtue. So then, this is the wisdom of the ancient desert, the wisdom of John Cassian, and the wisdom of Saint Benedict. How do we translate all of that into life today in 2022? To begin, we must never think that pride is something that God forbids because he's offended by it. He wants us to know him and to give ourselves to him. And pride prevents that from happening. The fact is, if I manage to get in touch with God at all, I naturally start to grow in true humility. This rootedness to the earth. As C.S. Lewis again puts it, feeling the infinite relief of having for once gotten rid of all the silly nonsense about your own dignity, which has made you restless and unhappy all your life. Lewis describes discovering true humility as being like a drink of cold water to someone in a desert. In our own day, pride very often manifests itself as competition. Pride doesn't get pleasure out of having something, like greed does, for example. Pride gets pleasure out of having more of something than others have, of winning the competition, of being richer than other people, smarter than other people, better looking, and so on. And the problem is that with God, we come up against someone who is immeasurably superior. And the person who is proud finds it very hard to get to know God. The proud person is always looking down on others, and so is incapable of seeing what is above. The God of the proud is an imaginary God. Pride is a spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense. We're all familiar with the parable in the Gospels of the Pharisee and the publican. The publican says, "Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner," and goes home having made peace with God. The publican discovered humility and feels completely liberated. The Pharisee goes home less forgiven. His relationship with God is not the same, because he is at the center, at the heart of things, and God is subservient to him. It doesn't mean that what he did was worthless. It simply means that as far as he's concerned, it has borne no fruit in holiness within himself. The deeds were good, but they were poisoned by pride. The beauty of what he did was totally marred because it was addressed neither to God nor to his neighbour. It was turned in on himself. I rather doubt that we can move from pride to humility in one single step, unless something so tragic happens to us that we see ourselves completely bereft of everything that supported our barren condition. This is what happened to Job in the Old Testament, but that is a rather rare occurrence in life. And this is why Benedict gives us 12 different steps. But there is one thing which we can all do right now. However much we think we are possessed of gifts of all sorts, we can remember the words of St. Paul. What have you got which was not given to you? Paul echoes at this point what Christ said in the very first of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. This is the kind of transfiguration with a small t that Lent hopes to bring about in each one of us. And our job during this holy season is to cooperate in the work which will bring it about.